Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Subsea Asia, the pre-day event for Capacity Asia here. My name's Chris Davison and I'm the product lead for Capacity Asia. Today we'll be shining a light on Asia's subsea cable industry. With an afternoon of dedicated content, I'm looking forward to the 3 sessions we've got coming up. We've witnessed an immense build-out of competitive cable routes, not only to the US, but also bypassing some traditional hubs and improving intra-Asia connectivity. I'd like to thank our diamond sponsors. There's the antitrust notice for you. I'd like to thank our diamond sponsors, China Unicom and NTT, our platinum sponsor, China Telecom, our gold sponsors, China Mobile International and Console Connect PCCW Global, our silver sponsors, Otter Globe and Princeton Digital Group, and all of our bronze sponsors without whom this wouldn't be possible today. First session of the day will examine the bond between subsea and data centers, and I'll hand over now to your moderator for the session, Robert Schult, Research Director at Telegeography, to begin the session.
Okay, well, I hope everybody's in the right place. We're here today to talk about the bond between subsea and data centers. So if you were looking for something else, you need to go to another room. We have a great panel today, and hopefully this introduces some of the topics that you'll hear about later. Panels later in the day, there's sessions on international cable outlook and intra-Asia cable outlook. But everything kind of comes to this integration of data centers and subsea, and that's what we'll touch upon today. There are a couple of themes that we wanted to get to, and I think these will come out through the questions that we walk through. We'll talk today about integration of subsea with data centers. We'll also talk about can and should the model of concentrated interconnection points change, right? Right now, certainly things are concentrated in Singapore, Hong Kong. Should they be more distributed? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about market factors. How can we make things easier in the marketplace? And then finally, we'll talk about things like network resiliency and latency and how we accommodate that when we start doing things at scale. So with that as an introduction, what I'd like to do is ask the panelists just to give a brief introduction themselves.
Sure. Hello, I'm Helen. I'm the head of strategy at Sunny Vision. Sunny Vision is a DC provider in Hong Kong. We operate and own Mega Eye among a few other data centers in Hong Kong. We recently also launched the first carrier-neutral cable landing station in Hong Kong. Pleasure to be on this panel.
Thank you, Helen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vinay Nagpal. I'm the president of InterGlobix. We primarily provide strategic business consulting services for the convergence of data centers and subsea. My background is primarily data centers for the last 27 plus years. And over the last 6 or so years, I've been working in the subsea sector and working on projects around the world, primarily focused around the convergence of subsea and data centers.
Hi, my name is Zubaid Yunus. I'm part of Meta Platforms. I'm part of the network investments team in APAC region. As you understand, most of you are users of our platform. We also invest a lot in terms of our digital infrastructure, subsea cables, data centers, pop locations and all. So it's a pleasure to be here face-to-face standing this session.
Great. Thank you. So I think first of all, we'll touch upon the state of subsea and basically talk about the integration of new sub-cable systems into the data center. And I guess my first question is, how has integration of sub-cables into the data center changed over time? Do we have the right model currently? You know, what should the standard be? Helen?
Okay, I'll go first. I think as a data center provider, our role to help with the success of the subsea cables is really to provide a vibrant ecosystem for the interconnections. And say Mega Eye in Hong Kong as an example, we host 9 subsea cables, city pops in Mega Eye, and we have 2 more coming within our metro ecosystem. And how we measure the metrics is that number of cross connects that we bring to these subsea cables. It's like more than like 500 or 600 cross connects for each city pops. And this is the vibrant community that we are offering because it's carrier neutral, because all the major NSPs and clouds are already there. That's why we could be able to have direct connections at lower cost, at lower diversity. I think the low cost and the high diversity and low latency is going to be still the standard going forward. But as the subsea cables have higher standards and evolve their open platforms and there are more OTT investments in these cables, the standard is going higher and higher. That's why we're trying to extend our carrier neutral position from Mega Eye to the shore end. And that's why we're doing it, building our carrier neutral cable landing station in Hong Kong, hopefully linking back to the Mega Eye ecosystem. But at the same time, it's just open up more opportunities for different terrestrial backbones to any data center in Hong Kong. I think that's probably the trend going forward and what value we're trying to bring to the subsea community.
So Rob, in terms of what has changed, I would say, a couple of key things that come to mind is, I think there's been a paradigm shift when it comes to subsea from a business model perspective. There used to be time when there were 12, as many as 16 at times, international carriers who used to get together and go through extruding feasibility study analysis and what have you, over 6 to 8 years to put a subsea cable, bring it to life. Those days are long gone. You're seeing a lot more nimble deployments when it comes to subsea, much more smaller consortiums. Yes, as Helen said, led by hyperscalers, and a lot of times, even having private cables for that matter, where hyperscalers are primarily, using the capacity more for their own purposes, for their cloud services. But also, I think there's been almost a 360-degree change when it comes to hyperscalers providing capacity to carriers, leasing to carriers versus the other way around. Then the second thing that comes to mind is that from a technology perspective, there's a continual push for the cable manufacturers to go for higher count cable when it comes to repeated cables in terms of number of fibers per cable, and also in terms of pushing the amount of traffic, amount of bandwidth per fiber pair. That's constantly increasing as well. So you're getting more cost-effective solutions which have a lot more capacity, and then you're seeing much more faster deployment of these systems.
You have something to add to that? Are we doing it right?
I think that's no. I think there is so I think from just to add to what Vinay added. Yes, there are different models of what subsea network has evolved with a bit of time. The nimble consortiums or private cables. Our approach to that has always been to build it as part of consortium or with partnerships. We have not gone into private cable route. But the one thing that's I think admirable is that the build out is being done faster. Whether it's just being nimble as a consortium partners or 3 or 4 partners, building consensus is much easier, getting to decision making is much faster, and then objective alignment is also good. If you have like 15, 16 partners and you're landing in 20, 30 different geographies, it makes things complicated. But it's not that those kind of investments are not being done. I think to Africa is a great example. It has something around 45 different landings across Africa, and I think it's one of the most complicated submarine projects that has ever been built. But I think it's like different models that coexist, and over the years, I think both the data center players, the landing station builds or service providers, and the submarine cables have opened up a lot from the days of where everything was provided by single supplier to decoupling the active equipments with the passive equipment. I think that brought in a lot of innovations, a lot of fast-tracked innovation into the world, and I think the overall industry benefited from it. So I think there's no one model fitted, but I think the way things are being innovated in terms of both commercial and technical way, I think it's going in the right direction.
You know, one of the things, if you're familiar with submarinecablemap.com, that's something that we run, and it tracks all of the different projects that are out there. You know, it's a resource to look at what cables exist today, what cables are planned, and we continuously see more and more cable systems on the intra-Asia pattern and the trans-Pacific pattern being added. You know, I guess clearly there's not enough capacity out there currently because, you know, there's a plan. How is the slowdown, or how has the delays in deployment of some of these cables affected hubs? You know, like in Hong Kong, clearly that there's been some effects there, right?
Yes, I think past 2 years, we've been definitely a little bit concerned about how the cables are coming to life. But I think over the past 6 months, we see that things are slightly moving faster. We've seen that there are a couple of intra-Asia cables already lining up with ADC and CH2X and XJC2, etc. As a local player in Hong Kong, we definitely see the demand is there. We are working with all the partners to try to catch up in anticipation of all the cables coming next year.
Right.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, if you, Rob, look at it even from a global perspective, there's a lot of emphasis on diversity when it comes to diverse landings. And that's really what triggered Virginia Beach in terms of, you know, the location and the Mid-Atlantic region, you know, obviously driven by, partly by Facebook and Microsoft and Telsius. So you need a landing party, that's clearly there. But in terms of avoiding the existing cable landing stations and the existing cables that are there in New York, New Jersey, or Florida, you know, Virginia Beach came about. You look at it across the Atlantic. You had Bilbao, Spain. Now there's more focus on in Lisbon, Portugal. You have Crete. So there are these new, you know, emerging locations that are coming up from a diversity perspective. To answer your question more directly, yes, you know, the delays from when it comes to supply chain perspective has affected, you know, globally for that matter. But at the same time, I think as an industry, what I see, there's a lot more focus on diverse locations. Diversity is very important.
I think the delays have hurted the industry in 2 ways. Number one was during the pandemic, we have seen the internet traffic gone twice in the first 6 months and then gone quadrupled over the time of pandemic, because the dependence on internet was like of a different nature altogether. It became the main utility, whereas any supply chain that you need to build to provide the better internet, it takes years and years. So all those submarine systems that were in place or were in flight, there was no way during the pandemic to kind of expedite them as in relation to how the traffic was growing. What complicated it further at point 2 was the changes in the regulatory regime, and I think that come in I think it's not a good timing for those regulatory changes to come in, and that there is a slightly more protectionism or nationalistic element to this, and I think that's delaying it further. However, whatever the projects that are in flight, once they land, they are high capacity projects. They are not smaller fiber count, low baud rate projects. They are high fiber count, high baud rate projects. So I think the industry will catch up quickly, provided all those regulatory issues are quickly resolved. And the governments and all the regulators, they understand that they need to work together to bring that internet capacity into this region, because it is a necessity. You can't live without it. And it just affects your competitive advantage as a country if you do not have a good internet infrastructure coming to you.
You mentioned Virginia Beach. One of the questions I had regarding integration of data centers is what happens if it's distant from the landing station, right? And you gave a couple of different examples. I mean, the Richmond data centers that you're looking at, right? That's not in Virginia Beach. I mean, there's an integration effort there. What challenges does that present?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, there is no magic formula that works across the board. I think that's very important to realize that. People a lot of times talk about Marseille, look at the success of Marseille, and be like, you know, when we have a subsea cable landing, can that location be a data center hub as well? Not necessarily. A lot of different attributes are going to play. Specifically in case of Virginia Beach, obviously Virginia Beach, you know, being a beach location, is the landing site. Even that now, you know, it started with Camp Pendleton, where the Maria subsea cable landed, followed by Brusa and then Dunant. But now there's a secondary location that just got approved, which is Sandridge, still in the Virginia Beach location area, but for a secondary location. To your specific point, the NAP, or the network access point, which is where you have the distribution of the traffic happening, where you have a lot of different types of terrestrial networks that are coming together, whether it's pure play dark fiber operators, CDNs, software-defined networks, metro providers, and that's where, you know, the traffic is exchanging. And there is obviously also peering exchange established recently by DKIX in Richmond. So all of that interconnection is happening in Richmond. The subsea cables are landing obviously in Virginia Beach. That distance is roughly around 95, 96 miles or so. So, you know, and what we're also observing is that the SLTE doesn't necessarily need to sit, you know, right by the beach. You have the PFE, and in some of the newer deployments, we're starting to see the SLTE move into a carrier-neutral data center. That neutrality is extremely important, and that's where, you know, you have, if as a data center operator, you can build your interconnection infrastructure on neutrality, attract subsea cables, you have a very good recipe for building that interconnection system.
Helen, one of the points you made, I think, early on was interconnection opportunities at the carrier landing station. I mean, is that an important aspect as well as we bring in new cables? And
yes, I just echo the point Vinay just made. I think there are some prerequisites or some key success factor for a carrier-neutral cable landing station. First of all, it's basically the city, whether the location is right. Geographically, maybe like places like Hong Kong or Singapore, etc., they are the ports of trade, and basically it's easy to access, like within 100 milliseconds to all major cities in Hong Kong. That's like an advantage that's not so easily taken off. A second is the deregulated market. Basically, it's how easy all the other telcos and CDNs and software-defined networks can come. So I think we have that early advantage, and then it's really how the data center, the cable landing station has its own advantage in terms of both interconnections back to the major city pops, and at the same time whether we have our own data center standard of cable landing station to facilitate the PFEs and SLTEs on site. So these facilitate the interconnection either in the carrier-neutral data center or back to for example, MACA-I through the dedicated dark fibers. These choices will allow all the cable owners to have more access to cheaper costs of fibers, more diversity, and I think that's very important for their interconnection considerations.
Anything to add to that? We can move. So yeah. So that's an interesting perspective. I think the next thing we were going to talk about, you know, is that link between the submarine cables and the data centers. And I think one of the things that we've seen, certainly Hong Kong, Singapore, is the traditional model has a very concentrated site of interconnection. It might be a campus, it might be a metro. There are many data centers in Hong Kong, obviously, but should we look to a more distributed model? I think, when you see new cable systems, whether they be Europe to Asia, you see some unique landing stations, you see expansion in places like Malaysia. There's some reasons for that. Should we look for a more distributed model? Ruben?
It must be. I think over the years we had these two connectivity hubs in Asia and they've served well. But back then the dependence and the use and the need for internet was very limited compared to today. Like obviously, those were from those point in time they were like fantastic. But I think now there is a there is a need to have that content or that facilities near to the user. And I think, as Vinay rightly pointed out, that there is a lot more focus on diversity as well, because these concentration or these connectivity hub, they will continue to serve as connectivity hubs for the longest future. But alongside those, there is always a need for midpoints, where you can have interconnects where you can connect between systems, where you can provide more diversity to route. I think even from a mathematical perspective, bringing two systems to a midpoint and then going from the two systems from that even to the same destination increases your probability of availability of the cables in that perspective. So I think there's always been a need for midpoints, but it's not about that. You can look at Hong Kong and Singapore and say, oh, that's a fantastic model, let's emulate. It's not easy to emulate. It's all the airline hubs, if you see, most of them are connectivity hubs, and it's no coincidence. Like it's just because they are ideally located, they have the right kind of infrastructure, they have a competitive environment, and there is a predictability about the infrastructure in there, and they have an open regulatory policy. You will find a couple of airline hubs which are not connectivity hub, and the only thing you will see different in that particular industry is that the telco industry is not as open as the aviation industry in those locations. So it's just having that faith in the long-term development of that midpoint and making regulatory decisions now from that perspective, I think is all the more important.
Right.
And that brings all the competition and openness in terms of your infrastructure. Like in Hong Kong, there is not even a consideration that one data center will not talk to another data center. It's not even a consideration. Over other areas, you kind of just have to kind of convince people to something that should be there from the day one. So that, I think, is that mindset needs to change, both from the regulatory perspective and also the investment perspective.
Sure. Vinay, do you have any view on distributed data centers in the region?
Yeah, I think, when you look at distributed data centers, right, so what you were saying about in Hong Kong, the fact that their data centers are interconnected, at the end of the day, that's what's more prevalent in various parts of the world, where you're seeing these clusters of data centers coming together, and you see more and more neutral IXs or internet exchange points connecting these data centers together. So having that data center neutrality element also becomes a key part of building an interconnection ecosystem, and that's what's happening in various parts of the world, actually, as we speak. And I think when it comes to the connectivity between the data centers, that is either driven by multiple data center operators, or you see carriers who are present in multiple data centers anyways, and the customers who are outsourcing their IT applications are also requiring that connectivity to happen between the data centers. So I think those days of having walled gardens as a data center operator are long gone. Having that open and neutrality element when it comes to connectivity is the key to survival.
Yeah, I think, and also I think this question is not like the either or. It's like whether just growing in the emerging market, or are these traditional hubs still growing? The fundamentals why these are traditional hubs is because they have their advantage. And I would question whether these advantages are still there. And I believe so, in terms of geographical access. For example, in terms of Hong Kong, it's still the gateway to access to mainland China market, etc. The fundamentals are still there. It's just that a lot of the hyperscales and cloud players, they're growing tremendously fast, that they need to grow at the same time in these hubs and at the same time in their eyeball locations. And I see that from Hong Kong perspective, we're seeing a lot more cross-connects to these emerging markets for diversity reasons, for the network infrastructure, and I think that basically they're growing together, and it's going to be a much more connected world, basically.
I think, too, one of the things that we look at is, can interconnection hubs solve problems, right? And I think when we look at the Trans-Pacific route in particular, and delays, particularly for cables that were going to land in Hong Kong, people are trying to find alternatives, in order to make it politically correct, right? They're trying to find solutions to both connect Hong Kong, but also meet some of the requirements that are out there by governments. So, if on the Trans-Pac route, do you see new markets or new hubs emerging? I don't know, do you have any views on that? or not?
I'll let
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of new hubs emerging, right? I mean, one area that's, I've been watching very closely in Denmark is the area around Blaberg, Endrup, and Esbjerg. So what's happening there is that there has been a natural convergence of data centers and subsea, primarily driven by bulk infrastructure. And you're starting to see hyperscalers gravitate towards it. And I think in a very natural way, you're seeing that region from an interconnection hub perspective evolve. Another one that I mentioned earlier, is Lisbon. There's a lot of activity there, and I think over the next several years, we'll see that both, again, from a data center and subsea perspective, growth being driven there. Crete is relatively new. There's a lot of focus there as well when it comes to subsea, and of course, Lambda Helix, a company bought recently by Digital Realty, they have plans for further growing that region. And then, of course, if you look at Barcelona in Spain, that's evolving to become an interconnection hub as well. So there's different, if you look around the world, I think I'm sure there are others as well. You start listing them out, and I think that really needs to happen. I mean, Robert, as you know, with John working on looking at, what Telegeography has published, the existing 10 major interconnection hubs. I mean, even that list needs to expand for diversification of the internet, for having more diversified hubs, and it's happening in a very natural way.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to add on, I think in Asia, what we see is that there are a lot more intra-Asia cables coming in to fill in the gaps. And I think all the destination along these intra-Asia cables are basically the next locations for a lot more interconnections. What we see is, like for ADC and SJC2, etc., we're seeing apart from Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, these traditional hubs, we're seeing Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and the list goes on. And then from our perspective, we're just seeing a lot more interconnections from these locations back to Hong Kong.
I think from a, geographically, if you look at, I think Japan has always been a kind of midpoint for all the Trans-Pacific and Inter-Asia cable. Will continue to kind of grow from that perspective. But then I think Philippines and Indonesia, and I would say the Borneo part of Malaysia, they all have a fantastic opportunity because geographically they are situated right in the middle of Pacific and South China Sea. So it's a fantastic opportunity for industry to take a look at and the regulators to kind of take a long-term view of how they want to develop that. For content providers and aggregators, they actually go with the peering system. So you need to have a peering system for us to connect. So our concentration or our build concentration will definitely go with the peering system. And if there is no peering system, just a connectivity hub will not thrive as much. So I think the industry as a whole has to look for more, because if you look at Indonesia, Philippines, and I would say Indonesia and Philippines together alone, they make 400 million people. It's not insignificant market not to have a connectivity hub there. Australia provides a unique opportunity as well, because they are also right in the middle of Trans-Pacific, of anything going towards Asia, or especially going towards South Asia, where more than 1.5 billion people live. So that's a unique position to be in. So I think 4 or 5 more midpoints can still survive together compared to what the internet needs would be in the next 10 to 15 years.
And Umaid, if I may, I'm happy to play the moderator, by the way. When you talk about peering hub, right, how important it is to you as a content provider when it comes to having a neutral peering provider versus a data center operator-based peering exchange?
I think neutrality is important. A neutral peering provider is important, but I think more and more, because of the nature of the business that we are in, we want to peer directly. So our data center model is more scalable, I would say. A neutral data center where different parties can come in and pair is more scalable. But for us, I think both these models have worked traditionally well. They will continue to grow depending on the market and depending on the choice of the partners that they are pairing with us. It varies. My personal view is that the data center as a real estate business, providing a neutral grounds for people to come in and have interactions is more scalable, per se.
Yeah, as long as it's open and neutral, absolutely.
Absolutely. Without neutrality, all this, these postulates, they don't exist.
Yeah, and Helen, I think that was the point that you made, right? I mean, that's been your approach at Sunnyvision.
Yeah, exactly, because our mother company is real estate company in Hong Kong, Sun Hong Kai. So we are very focused on just the Hong Kong market, and we want to fight in the Hong Kong market. We are not competing against any of our customers per se in the whole ecosystem. Basically, the whole ecosystem is our customers. So I think the neutrality of letting all the NSPs and content providers coming in at a level playing ground so that they could connect equally with diversity and with a lower cost, because there's a lot more competition, is how we could make the Hong Kong, our data center, more as a hub in the future.
Right.
And so, Helen, I think if I remember when I spoke with Raymond, so Sunnyvision operates and runs its own internet exchange in your campus, right?
We own, first of all, the HKIX is not owned by Sunnyvision. It's a non-profit HKIX. But because MegaEye is so important, they have 2 satellite sites within our campus. And this is the fastest growing satellites. So we basically, all people who connect to HKIX is cross-connect, basically.
Sure. Right. Is the definition of a neutral data center consistent across markets in Asia Pac? And what can be done to make them more consistent? Because I think, right, you're saying a predictable, even playing field is what's important. I mean, what do you think?
Yes, I think neutrality is not, like what we have experienced is not consistent. I think, like if you look at the proposals and the marketing and the sales pitch, most of the establishments, they want to call themselves neutral, but neutrality in what sense? Like if a small interconnect cable costs you millions and millions of dollars just to kind of go from one rack to another rack, it still is neutral, but it's a barrier. So I think not only it has to be neutral, it has to be, I would say, equitable. Like it's easier, and I think that we were just having this discussion earlier, but data center business in itself is like a kind of a real estate business. Everything else should be to enable that business to grow as a real estate business, that you get the best occupancy of your, per square inches of space, you have the best efficient power that you can provide, and that power cost is predictable, and in the long term is cheaper. Everything else is like enablers. How many fiber it connects, how many metro fiber it connects, how many interconnect cables you can provide. So those things are not consistent as far as my personal opinion is concerned. I think it varies from region to region. Even the data centers locations are neutral. Then the metro fiber that requires to connect to one data center to another is not neutral. And if it's neutral, it's heavily tilted towards incumbents, and then they charge £1 of flash for you for getting one extra fiber pair on a 144 core that is just sitting idle. So I think those things are like enablers, and those should be taken into account when discussing and deciding on the neutrality.
Yeah, and also to add to that, Rob, in Asian market, I mean, in a country like India, you're seeing data center operators being asked by the customers to install fiber connecting their data centers for the reason that you just mentioned, which is the incumbents are just charging whatever they want with no rationale behind those price points. And as a data center operator, you're seeing more data center operators kind of going out, getting their own licenses to install fiber, to offer, whether it's dark fiber or lit services. However, it's, I think, at the same time, keeping that separate from the data center business, because you don't want to, intertwine the data center and the network business, right? But you're seeing that happen more and more in multiple cases that I've heard.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess for us, it's neutral means we allow others to have as many choices as possible. So say, take our example, if people want to have the cheapest cost from our cable line station to MegaEye, of course, we have our own fibers that offer the lower cost, but that is not to say that this is the only choice you can make. You have, we are open to all the different terrestrial backbones, and you could even connect from our cable landing station to any other data centers that are in Hong Kong. I think that's the neutrality. And back to UA's focus, we're only focused on data center itself, and the rest of it is enablers that you could choose from. We're just giving them plenty of choices.
Right. Good. I realize this panel moves very quickly. We have a lot to cover even still, but we'll jump ahead a little bit and talk about network resiliency. Integration into the data center of submarine cable capacity is super important. I think it presents certain risks though, right? When we talk about concentrating connectivity in big hubs. For hyperscalers, businesses, economies, there are risks of having that concentration. Have they been sufficiently mitigated? I mean, by building out the metro networks that interconnect all the data centers, have they been considered? Are people realizing that and pushing for more diversity?
Yeah. So there is no binary answer to it. The more we mitigate the risk, the more we see, okay, what's the next step of what next more likely risk. I think so far the diversity plans that generally the industry has moved on to, they're working well. Obviously, it's not that you decide on having a new diverse concentration location and it starts happening. It takes 10, 15 years of ecosystem to kind of build in. I think things are going in the right direction. Once we'll reach to that point, we'll see the more risk coming in. One good example is that there's a lot more activity in subsea in Indonesia recently because everything else was concentrated, and then so once those systems are up and running, only then we'll realize what are the challenges in those seas, and then you have to kind of diversify and solve for those risks. So I think this thing will keep on evolving, but I think the way the industry is looking at different directions, I think in the past 2-3 years, the whole peering system has progressed a lot out of the concentration hubs only, but it has gone more into, there's a lot of neutral data center build that happened in India and Indonesia in the past 3-4 years. They were not there, or those were not announced before. So I think things are going in the right direction. I think Philippines has made some changes into the 100% ownership. So I think there's a lot more data center activity and lot more infrastructure activity back in the Philippines as well. So I think these are all good signs. Once we resolve some of the regulatory issues on the subsea systems, and these systems not only going to the traditional hubs, will also land in some of these locations, I think we'll see a lot more change in the ecosystem.
Do you see sufficient planning to deliver the resilient networks?
I think sufficient and more is all relative. I think it's an iterative process, and we'll continue to see that as an industry. What's happening is the emphasis on diversification, the emphasis on decentralization of peering, that will continue to happen, and these things take time. They really take a long time to come to fruition. So that's where things are headed, and I think all the different subsectors of the industry realize the importance of that, and we'll continue to see that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other factors in resilient networks is things like latency, right? Just because you have a redundant path doesn't mean it will meet your needs. I think we talked on the call about the metaverse, right? And everybody will have an application that is latency dependent, right? I mean, is that a consideration when you're building out networks and trying to factor in multiple paths? Is every path latency or deliver sufficient latency?
It is a consideration for sure, because all the future experiences will have one more variable to look at too. But I think there are different aspects of design element. One is the capacity. So you need to ensure that you have an ample amount of pipe that is available between the connectivity hubs. Then you have the diversity that if the worst comes to worst, you still have enough capacity pipe available. And then you see, okay, what is your optimized? So then within the architecture, you can always prioritize the low latency routes for some of the experiences that require low latency. You don't have to send your cache refresh on the same latency path as you are sending your live calls, because they both have different grade of service needs. So that that intelligence is always there on the active system. So that is there. So yes, it is consideration that if we have 3 diverse paths, they should all have reasonable latency, but at least one path should have enough good performance to serve as a primary path for some of those experiences that the metaverse or the future applications will bring.
Good. All right, well, to wrap this up, I think what I'll do is I'll ask each of you for any last remarks. If you have any final comments you'd like to make just about integration of subsea and data centers, and maybe what you think the outlook is in the near term.
Sure, I'm happy to go first. So I think, as an industry, what we have seen over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a concerted effort, both from a data center perspective and also from a subsea perspective, to understand each other's importance. That will continue to evolve. Not necessarily all data center providers are going to start investing in subsea and vice versa, but I think there's a very conscious awareness in the industry about the strategic importance of these two subsectors of digital infrastructure industry. When it comes to hyperscalers, obviously the hyperscalers, I tell people all the time that they are continuing to drive their own builds, both in terms of data center and subsea. At the same time, in parallel, they're leasing capacity as well. So that's happening in parallel. So I think we will see that, go through a few more iterative cycles as things evolve. And I think that coordination between the data center and subsea industry working more closely together, we'll see more of that happening.
I would say that as a data center provider, I think still, as what I said at the very beginning, the role of us is really to facilitate the neutral interconnection. And I think that will still hold true for us, and it's the core of our strategy. No matter we're doing data centers or we're doing cable landing station, to provide this vibrant ecosystem of everyone on the same level playing field. And I think if everybody is doing what we're good at, that makes the industry most vibrant.
I think in the past 12 years, all these content aggregators and application providers have invested more than $880 billion in infrastructure, both from data centers to the metro fibers to submarine networks. And that has taken industry forward by leaps and bounds. I think that innovation will continue to move. However, there will be a renewed focus on having a lot more green technologies to power your data centers, and that will require some changes in how the internet architecture currently works. Because both Hong Kong and Singapore are limited by the amount of land that they have that can produce the green energy. So there has to be more innovative thinking of how the region can work together. If the concentrations hub cannot produce green energy, then there should be green energy hubs that can provide the right kind of energy to that concentration hub. So that will be another area where there will a lot more progress will happen in the next 5 to 10 years. I think industry as a whole, there was a lot of capital available in the past 2-3 years that has slightly dried up. When it was available, it was changing hands, like one infrastructure company is buying assets of another infrastructure company. That is important because then they kind of scale up and kind of invest more, but that also increases the valuation without actually increasing the on-ground capacity of those data centers. So I think that is another area to kind of look into, that more and more there should be some appetite for all these infrastructure funds as well to go into some of these neutral areas, some greenfield builds, look at a long-term perspective and not look at like 3 to 5 years of kind of changing hands. I think that will serve the industry bad, but I think the demand for more capacity and demand for more compute will remain solid in the next 5 to 10 years.
All right, good. Well, we're out of time now. The questions that have been presented, I'm sure the panelists would be happy to answer on the side. And thank you very much. Thank you, panelists, and thank you for attending.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert, Ubaid, Vinay, and Helen, for taking the stage there and having that conversation to open up the Subsea Day. I hope everyone got some actionable takeaways there. Next up, we've got a panel discussion looking specifically at the intercontinental cable routes, so please hang around for the next couple of minutes when we'll begin. Thank you again.